Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another enlightening session of ToxTime. I'm thrilled to be your host, Jenny Olivos. In today's ToxTime, we're honored to have Dr. David Galbis-Reig and Guida Brown joining us for this compelling topic. It's about the brain, not the substance. Dr. Galbis-Reig received his Doctor of Medicine degree from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia in 1999, and completed a residency in internal medicine at Aurora Sinai Medical Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 2004. He is board certified and involved in maintenance of certification in internal medicine by the American Board of Internal Medicine and in the subspecialty of addiction medicine by the American Board of Preventive Medicine. Guida Brown, principal of Guided by Guida, has over 30 years of experience working in nonprofits. More than 15 of those years were working with individuals with substance use disorders. Guida is a substance abuse counselor, FAS disorder trainer, and intoxicated driver program assessor certified by the state of Wisconsin. Please note opinions presented by this session are those of the presenter and do not reflect any official policy or position at USDTL. We have a lot of attendees today, so we will try to answer the questions that are most relevant to the presenter's expertise during our limited Q&A time. And without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Dr. David Galbis-Reig.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk briefly about the etiology or the origins of substance use disorders, recognizing that the definition has changed over time. And so my title is It's About the Brain, Not the Substance. Even though we tend to identify substance use disorders by substance, it's really not about the substance at all. And I'll kind of go through that. So the objectives will be to articulate a definition for addiction as a brain disease, understand how to recognize and diagnose substance use disorders, understand in basic terms how evidence-based treatment of addiction permits the brain to heal and restore normal neurobiology. The neurobiology of addiction in a nutshell is really the brain's, and again, keep in mind the brain is the focus. Anything that you take that makes you feel good leaves an imprint on the brain, and it leaves an imprint in the way that our brain recalls what that felt like. So there is a memory that becomes imprinted in a part of the brain that we then draw on, particularly when we're not feeling well, to how to feel better again. So substance use typically starts not because someone is actually looking to get quote unquote high, but rather because they're looking for relief of some type of suffering. It might be emotional suffering, mental suffering, physical suffering, and sometimes it's especially in young adults and adolescents, it may even be a social suffering in the sense of trying to fit in. So while this cartoon is not the best and in itself is not perfect, it does illustrate that there is a reason people use substances. It is not, people don't use substances because they feel bad or they make them feel bad. They use substances because they make them feel something positive. And the important thing when we talk about addiction is to recognize that addiction is a primary chronic disease of the brain, reward system, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. This is, by the way, the definition by the American Society of Addiction Medicine. I think it's a very comprehensive definition. And it starts by really highlighting the importance of the brain when we talk about addiction. It is a brain disease first and foremost. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. And this is reflected in individuals pathologically pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors. Addiction is characterized by an inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, cravings, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and dysfunctional emotional responses. So that if you think about this, the disease of addiction is a brain disease that affects every aspect of a person's being. And that's an important concept because it leads to some of the issues that we see with stigma. Because unlike things like diabetes, where the primary sufferer, the primary person suffering is the individual themselves, with the disease of addiction, because of the nature of the brain and because the brain is so important for our ability to function within a society, and we are a society of individuals, we don't live in a bubble, it makes it much more difficult for a person with addiction to interact with their environment, which also affects not just the individual, but can harm relationships and responsibilities that individual has to that social network. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. Without treatment or engagement in recovery activity, addiction, like any chronic disease, is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. And I often tell my patients, addiction is really no different than cancer. If I get diagnosed with a cancer and I say, look, I don't want any treatment, most likely, not 100% of the time, but most likely the cancer is going to progress and it's going to result in my demise. Addiction is no different. Without appropriate treatment and management, it progresses. And while some types of addiction, for example, nicotine or tobacco addiction, which kills more people than any other substance, takes years to progress to that endpoint, some addictions, like opiate use disorder, can progress very rapidly to death. So the substance matters in the sense of some substances can produce an endpoint much quicker than other substances, but they all ultimately lead to the same outcome if it's not treated. And I've developed over time, when I talk to clients and patients about addiction, there's a lot of confusion about addiction. And what I mean by that is people say, well, when my patients will tell me, well, I don't have a problem with cocaine. Yeah, I know I was positive for cocaine, but that's not the issue. Alcohol is the issue. And I tell them, well, wait a second. No, that's not correct. The issue isn't alcohol and it's not cocaine. It's your brain. And so I've come up with this analogy that I use when I talk to patients, which I think helps them understand the old terminology that we don't use any longer, this term of cross addiction. There really isn't a cross addiction. There's just addiction, okay? Because again, it's about the brain. So in this wagon wheel that I have here, you'll see that the brain, and okay, I'm not the best artist, so excuse me, but that little brain in the spoke of that, the middle of that wheel is supposed to be a brain, just in case anyone hasn't figured that out. So at the center of the wheel is the brain. The spokes that come out of the brain and interact with the wheel itself, the environment, in which the wheel then interacts with the environment, those spokes each represent a specific substance, a specific behavior. I mean, it can be anything. I just listed a few here of the majority of the more common classes of substances and one behavior, gambling, just to have a behavioral addiction in there. The spokes represent the specific stimuli that leads to potentially that individual developing the disease of addiction. But once you have the disease of addiction, so once you have a diagnosis of one type of substance use disorder or some type of addiction, your brain is primed to easily substitute any other spoke on that wheel. So in the old terminology in the 1990s and so forth, people would talk about cross addiction. Well, if you have an alcohol use disorder, you can easily transition or you can become cross addicted to cocaine. Well, that's not how it works. Essentially, there's a final common pathway for the development of addiction. It involves that circuitry of reward. So essentially, we have these areas of the brain that are involved with telling us what feels good and what feels bad. So I love French fries. I eat French fries. I immediately get a reward because my brain says, oh, I love that. That feels good. So a little dopamine is released in this area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And that rewards me internally. It makes me feel good. And so in the next time I eat a French fry, I'll know I'm going to feel good. And it's part of those rewards that you get for things that make you feel good. Things that make you feel bad, on the other hand, you don't get that reward, and it may actually cause a little, I mean, it can cause pain. Some things cause pain. If you put your hand on a hot stove, you ain't going to get rewarded for that. You're going to get pain for that. And that's your brain also telling you, nope, not good. Don't do that again, because that's going to hurt. So the positive things that happen, the things that make us feel good, whether it's a substance, whether it's a behavior, whether it's an individual, those things create a lasting impression in our memory banks in our brain. So when we use tobacco for the first time as an adolescent, which is the average age is 12, so you're 12 years old, someone offers you a cigarette, you use a cigarette, you take that first puff, the nicotine causes some chemical reactions, eventually leading to the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, which rewards you for taking that puff. Your brain creates this memory not only of what it feels like to take that puff, but everything that was going on around that puff. So how you held the cigarette, how you took the puff, what kind of cigarette, how it tasted, the people you were around. So you start to form this memory around events, and that's what we call learned conditioning. So there's some things that go around in the environment that also link us with the feel-good feeling. So when I talk about this wagon wheel, and the reason I like to use the analogy of a wagon wheel is constantly interacting with its environment. That's why I have these little blades of grass at the bottom, which kind of look funny. But as this wagon wheel goes through life, as our brain goes through life, as we interact with our environment, we pick up a lot of these different things. We interact with things, and we try things. Some of them feel good, and some of them feel bad. There are certain foods we absolutely abhor. There are other foods we love. And part of that is because our brain has learned this makes me feel good. I like this. I like how it tastes. I like how it feels. I want more of that. I hate how this tastes. I hate how this feels. I don't want more of that. And so we start to develop these memories, these circuits in our brain that help us go towards the things that make us feel good. And addiction is no different than that. The only problem with addiction is that it actually takes over that area of the brain. In other words, it's a saboteur that basically comes in and just basically takes over that part of the brain, so that all you want is now that one reward. So whether it's alcohol or cannabis or opiates or nicotine, whatever it is, you live for that reward. And certain substances are more rewarding than others, and we'll kind of get to that in a little bit. So I want you to think of addiction as an interaction with the environment. The other thing I tell people is, so let's say as soon as you're born, I put you on a desert island. There's no substances, no alcohol, nothing. There is nothing except there's food. You get provided with food and you get sustenance, but there's nothing else. If you never are exposed to any substance, any drugs, any alcohol, any behavioral issues, the risk of developing addiction is very small, because that circuitry won't develop. So part of that environmental interaction is also our upbringing. So people always ask me, well, addiction is genetic. And I tell them, yes, there is a genetic predisposition. It's very strong. It's about 60% hereditary. So that's why the brain, again, it's a brain disease. There is a predisposition to really foster that circuitry. But there's also that environmental component, which is the other 40%. So even someone who has a very strong genetic predisposition to develop addiction, if they're never exposed to anything that will trigger that circuitry to turn on, they won't develop addiction. And even if they are exposed, there's still a probability that they won't develop addiction, because it depends on the exposure, and it requires a certain amount of time for exposure. And a lot of that varies by individuals. But that is something to keep in mind. Unfortunately, what happens in our world, in the real world, not in a world where I can take a baby out of their situation and put them in the middle of a desert with nothing that they'll ever interact with. Many patients who develop addiction are born to families that already have addiction. So now you've got the double whammy. You've got the behavior, the brain, the genetics, but then you also have the environment, because one parent or both parents may already be in the throes of addiction. And so they're using already some substance or multiple substances. And therefore that child is growing in an environment where they're exposed to that constantly. And not only are they exposed to it, but it also normalizes the behavior. I mean, because a lot of those children, when they watch their parents do this, that becomes normative. They think that is how people are supposed to be. So they've got that double whammy. So that's important to keep in mind. So as we go through life and we're exposed to different substances, and usually the first substances people are exposed to as adolescents are the top three: the cannabis, alcohol, and nicotine. The average age of first use for most patients of nicotine or cannabis is about 12 years old. That age has been slightly dropping a little bit over the years, but it stayed pretty stable around 12. Alcohol is a little bit older, but 12, 13 in that age, 13 to 14 sometimes, it depends. Most of the other substances tend to be a little bit later. And what I mean by that is 15, 16, sometimes 17. So most people start with what are considered the legal substances, and I'm putting cannabis in that category, even though here in Wisconsin it's not, because in many states now it is legal. And so those are the initial substances that introduce someone. And in individuals with a predisposition to develop addiction, if their brain develops that circuitry, if their reward centers and the areas of their brain that deal with motivation start to change and they develop the circuitry, they can develop a use disorder, mild, moderate, or severe. And if they do, unfortunately, as an adolescent or young adult, the likelihood that they're going to carry that on forward is much, much higher. And they're much more likely to develop that in adolescent and young adulthood, because the brain, those areas of the brain are in rapid development during that time. So that's important to remember, is that addiction is also a developmental disease. It starts in adolescence. Most people are going to get diagnosed between adolescence and young adulthood, so between the ages of usually between the ages of 15 and 25. Although we're seeing a little bit of a shift with COVID, changed a lot of stuff, but between 15 and 25 is the average age. And then it'll be a relapsing remitting disease. Some people may remit for many, many years, or may remit for the rest of their life after adolescence, but that's when we typically start to see those diagnoses come. This is a very busy slide, but essentially it goes through the different processes leading up to addiction. So we do see that these are the brain areas that are involved with the disease of addiction. And you can see that most of these brain areas are deep inside the brain. These are primitive structures of the brain that most animals have. They're the structures that allow an animal to know, I like this, I don't like this, this hurts, this doesn't hurt. It's not the primary thinking parts of the brain. And what I mean by that is the cortex, the big part, the what makes us human, the less animalistic parts. So it's kind of an interesting thing to know that many of these circuits are deep inside the brain and are very, very ancient structures that most mammals will have to some extent. Ours are bigger, but most mammals will have these, including the areas of memory and the hippocampus and the amygdala, emotion. So, I mean, anything that you interact with the environment will develop a memory and an emotional response. And the orbitofrontal cortex is involved in motivation. And I told you that each substance has a different response as far as how rewarding it is. So on average, if there's a food you like, so like for me it's French fries, I'll get rewarded, but with about 125 units of dopamine in that nucleus accumbens. which is probably the lowest reward you can have, but it has to be rewarding. And if you think about it, that's an evolutionary thing, right? I mean, if you don't get rewarded for something, if it doesn't feel good, you're probably not going to keep doing it. So we kind of have to eat to survive. So it makes sense that food and water is rewarding. Graduation, so a happy event in someone's life. People are happy for you. It's kind of more of a social reward. 150 units. Orgasm has a reward. It's 200 units. Marijuana is about 325. Heroin 400, cocaine 600, and by far the most rewarding substance known to man is methamphetamine. It's 1,000 units of dopamine, which is, if you look at this, the progression of substance use tends to follow this course pretty close, except for heroin and cocaine. And heroin, the problem with heroin isn't that it's rewarding, it's that you get, once you develop that physiological dependence, so once that brain chemistry has been altered enough and you develop this physiological dependence, the punishment you get if you don't use, in other words, the withdrawal is so great that you start to continue to use, not because it's rewarding anymore, because it isn't. And if you ask people that are using opiates for a long time, they'll tell you, I get nothing out of it. I just have to use in order to feel normal. Because if they don't use, they get very sick very fast, and they don't like that. That's very different than cocaine and methamphetamine. So it's important to know that each substance works a little different. So this is the wagon wheel again. But what I've done is I've changed I've used the thickness of the arrow to indicate the amount of reward someone gets out of it. So in this representation, behavioral addictions such as gambling tend to be lower. They tend to be about as rewarding as orgasm, so about 200 units, whereas most of the substances are going to be much more rewarding. And interestingly enough, nicotine and nicotine is actually fairly rewarding. And there's a lot of other things that go into the formulation of the addiction. There's a lot of habitual, ritualistic things, but this kind of tells you the degree of the reward and the likelihood that someone who uses that substance is going to want to repeat that more and more just to feel good. Yeah, and obviously stimulants tend to be the most rewarding of the substances on this list. And brain recovery, people always ask me, well, you just mentioned that this is a chronic brain disease, so it changes the brain. And I say, absolutely, it changes the brain. And this is the evidence. These are PET scans. This is a healthy control on the left. So this is a person, and this is showing dopamine activity, and this is the deep centers of the brain. And you see the bright red means more activity, the blue or purpley color, that's less activity. And you see that in the central area of the brain, in a healthy control, there's a lot of activity going on. When you use substances, a lot of this activity goes away. All the red disappears. There's some yellow left and a little bit of green, but it's a lot of it's gone. And you can see in this middle picture, this is a month of abstinence. You still see that there's a lot of dysfunction. There's not very much red. So there's very little activity still taking place compared to a healthy control. And it takes a long time. Look at 14 months of abstinence all the way on the right. Okay. At 14 months of abstinence, you start to see the red. I mean, you see a lot of red, but it still doesn't look as large of an area as the healthy control. So this is the progression of recovery. Now, the sad thing is, if you look at the brain on the right, and this is something I always point out, is you see all these holes, these black areas in the brain, that's dead tissue. So methamphetamine kills brain cells very quickly. In the healthy brain, healthy control, you don't see any holes except for the ones you should see. Those are what we call the cisterns. In the methamphetamine brain at 14 months of abstinence, you see all these other holes that should not be there. And that's very sad, and that's irreversible. That damage is irreversible. That is dead brain. And methamphetamine does that very quickly. I'm not going to belabor this. There are diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders. They're validated criteria. They do change over time. This is the latest iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. There are 11 criteria. We now do not talk about dependence because dependence is a very confusing term because there's physiological dependence and then there's the addiction. We do use the term addiction, but it's changed a little bit. Now we tend to classify disorders as mild, moderate, or severe. Again, we diagnose it based on the substance of choice, not because the disease is about the substance, because as human beings, we have to classify it as something, and it's weird to classify it as a mild cocaine brain disorder, a mild, I mean, so we just say mild cocaine use disorder, mild, moderate, or severe. I think in the future there'll be different terminology, but for now, that's what we're using. And these are the criteria have changed over time as we've learned more about the disease. And the latest has actually added the criteria of craving, which was not present in any of the previous iterations of treatment. And this is actually a very important distinguishing criteria because very few diseases cause craving. So it's pretty interesting. And with that, I think we can move on to questions. Hopefully that was helpful.
Subscribe to our channel to see more videos like this.